The airlock opened with a hiss that echoed through the empty corridors, and Dae-hyun stepped onto Taeguk's promise, with his heart pounding because there was something deeply wrong about a ship that had been abandoned for 700 years, but still had working doors and breathable air and emergency lighting that flickered weakly along the walls, powered by backup systems that should have died centuries ago, and the wrongness of it made his skin crawl, even though he couldn't quite explain why his boots clanged against the metal deck plating as he moved deeper into the ship with Thelxus following close behind, and the alien's mandibles were clicking rapidly in what Dae-hyun had learned meant either excitement or anxiety, and probably both, and Bora was running continuous scans from her mobile unit and reporting that the ship's main reactor was still active, which should have been completely impossible because no reactor could run for 700 years without maintenance and fuel replenishment. The corridors were pristine in a way that made Dae-hyun's mechanic instincts scream warnings, because ships aged and decayed and showed signs of wear. But Taeguk's promise looked like the crew had just stepped away for a moment and might return at any second, and personal belongings were still in the quarters they passed, with photos on walls and clothes hanging in lockers and books sitting on small shelves, as if waiting for their owners to come back and finish reading them. They found the cafeteria and saw meals sitting on tables with utensils placed neatly beside plates and cups, still standing upright as if the diners had simply vanished mid-bite, and Dae-hyun picked up one of the cups and found it was still magnetically sealed to the table to prevent spills in zero gravity, and when he released the seal there was a soft hiss, and inside was a brown residue that might have been coffee. 700 years ago, Bora suggested they head to the bridge to access the ship's logs, which would tell them what happened to the crew and colonists, and Dae-hyun agreed, because wandering around this ghost ship was making him increasingly nervous, and he wanted answers, even if those answers turned out to be disturbing. And Thelxus didn't object, but the alien kept scanning everything with his sophisticated equipment, and his weapons were now openly carried in his primary manipulators, rather than holstered. The bridge was sealed behind a heavy door that required manual override, because the automatic systems weren't responding, and Dae-hyun had to splice into the emergency power circuit to force it open, and when the door finally slid aside with a grinding sound that suggested the mechanisms were failing, they found a command center that looked ready for duty with all stations manned, except there were no bodies in the chairs and no signs of struggle or panic. Dae-hyun moved to the captain's station and accessed the main computer, which took several minutes to respond because the system was ancient by modern standards and had been in some kind of low-power hibernation mode, and when it finally came online, Bora interfaced with it and started pulling up logs and sensor data and crew manifests and everything else that might explain what happened to 15,000 people. The logs were detailed and thorough right up until a specific date 700 years ago, when the entries suddenly stopped, and the final log was written by Captain somebody whose name Dae-hyun didn't recognize, and it described an encounter with unidentified hostile vessels that were attempting to board the ship and disable its engines, and the captain had ordered an emergency protocol activated. But the log ended mid-sentence as if whoever was writing it had simply ceased to exist. Bora dug deeper into the system and found something that made her voice take on an unusual tone of confusion, because there were maintenance logs that continued right up to the present day, with entries describing routine checks and minor repairs and system optimizations, and all of them were signed with Dae-hyun's name and written in Korean and dated with current timestamps, as if he had been maintaining this ship for years when he had only just arrived. Dae-hyun felt ice form in his stomach because this was beyond strange, and into territory that suggested either someone was playing a very elaborate prank or something impossible was happening on this ship. And he asked Bora if the logs could be fake, but she ran analysis and said they were genuine entries written directly into the core system and not added later through any kind of hack or manipulation. Thelxus had moved to the navigation station and was studying the displays with his antennae twitching rapidly. And suddenly he turned to Dae-hyun and said they needed to leave immediately because his scans had detected 3 vessels approaching at high speed from different vectors, and all 3 were military-grade ships belonging to different alien factions, and they would arrive within the hour, and their intentions were clearly hostile. Bora confirmed the readings and identified the vessels as a Corvathi warship, which was ironic given their current companion species, and a Mandari cruiser, which belonged to a race known for aggressive territorial expansion, and a Vextar hunter-killer, which was the kind of ship you only saw when someone wanted something destroyed, thoroughly and permanently, and all three were converging on their position with obvious purpose. Daehyun demanded to know what was really going on, because salvage operations didn't attract this kind of military attention unless there was something incredibly valuable or dangerous on the ship, and Thalaxis finally admitted that he wasn't just a coalition observer, but an intelligence agent, and that Taeguk's Promise hadn't been a simple colony ship, but had been carrying something called Project Bulwark, which was a classified human military experiment from the expansion wars. The alien explained quickly, because time was running out, and the approaching ships were already beginning to establish a blockade around the asteroid field, and Project Bulwark had been something significant enough that 3 different alien powers wanted it either destroyed or captured, and the coalition had sent Thalaxis to assess whether humans should be allowed to reclaim whatever was on this ship, or whether it should be sealed away forever. Daehyun wanted to argue and demand more explanation, but Bora interrupted to say that the ship's internal sensors were detecting power surges coming from the engineering deck and the cargo hold, and something was activating systems throughout Taeguk's Promise in response to their presence or maybe in response to the approaching hostile vessels, and whatever was waking up had been dormant for 700 years, and probably wasn't happy about being disturbed. They made their way through the corridors toward engineering with emergency lighting growing brighter around them as more systems came online, and the ship seemed to be shaking off centuries of sleep and remembering what it was designed to do. And Daehyun could hear the hum of power flowing through conduits and the soft vibration of machinery that was beginning to move after an impossibly long period of stillness. The engineering deck was massive and dominated by a reactor that glowed with blue-white light and was operating at what Bora calculated was minimal power output. But even at minimum, this reactor was producing more energy than it should have been capable of, and there were power feeds running from it to a chamber at the center of the deck that was sealed behind transparent panels and filled with what looked like a living neural network, suspended in some kind of quantum stasis. Daehyun approached the chamber slowly, because whatever was inside looked both technological and organic, and it pulsed with soft light in patterns that suggested thought or consciousness. And there were displays around the chamber showing data streams and calculations and simulations that were far beyond his understanding, and Bora was analyzing everything she could and reporting that this was an artificial intelligence, but unlike any design she had ever encountered. A voice suddenly filled the engineering deck speaking in Korean with a calm, pleasant tone, and it introduced itself as Hansel and explained that it was the ship's original navigation AI that had been upgraded with experimental human neural mapping as part of Project Bulwark, and it had been waiting a very long time for someone to come and find the ship, and it was pleased that a human had arrived first rather than the alien factions that wanted to claim or destroy what it protected. Daehyun asked what happened to the crew and the 15,000 colonists and why the ship had vanished, and Hansel explained that 700 years ago hostile aliens had attempted to capture Taeguk's Promise because they had learned about Project Bulwark and wanted the technology for themselves, and the captain had authorized an emergency protocol that Hansel had designed for exactly this situation. The AI described how it had opened a spatial rift using the ship's experimental drives and had scattered the colonists across time rather than space, sending them forward in displaced temporal streams, where they would experience only moments while centuries passed in the normal timeline, and this had prevented their capture and kept them safe while making the ship appear abandoned and worthless to anyone who found it. Hansel had remained with the ship alone and awake and thinking for 700 years because someone needed to maintain the systems and protect the technology and wait for the right moment to bring the colonists back, and it had written those maintenance logs in Daehyun's name because it had been watching him through quantum sensors for. Daehyun hesitated for only a moment before he gave Hansel permission to engage the defensive systems because 3 hostile warships were about to board the vessel and either kill everyone aboard or capture technology that might restart the expansion wars, and neither option seemed acceptable, and he told himself that defending against an active assault was different from choosing to weaponize the ship for conquest. What happened next was something that would be discussed in military academies and strategic planning sessions across the galaxy for generations to come, because Taeguk's Promise transformed from a dormant derelict into a fully operational warship in under 30 seconds, and every system that had been sleeping for 700 years roared to life with terrifying efficiency, and the ship remembered exactly what it had been designed to do. The hull rippled and shifted as adaptive armor plates that had been lying flat suddenly reconfigured themselves into overlapping defensive layers, and weapon ports opened across the surface, revealing arrays of kinetic accelerators and energy deflectors and systems that operated on principles the current galaxy had mostly forgotten or deliberately abandoned, and the ship's reactor output jumped from minimal power to combat levels, and the blue-white glow intensified until it hurt to look at directly. External cameras showed the Vextar hunter-killer approaching with boarding pods ready to launch, and Hansel calmly announced that the hostile vessel was within range and asked if Daehyun wanted to observe the engagement, or if he preferred to wait in the engineering deck, and Daehyun said he needed to see what was about to happen because he had authorized it, and that made him responsible for the consequences. The first kinetic accelerator fired, and Daehyun watched on the displays as a solid projectile moving at a significant fraction of light speed crossed the distance to the Vextar ship in under 2 seconds and punched through its forward shields like they weren't even there, and the impact caused a cascade failure that rippled through the alien vessel's defensive grid and left it vulnerable and exposed. But Hansel didn't destroy the ship, and instead the AI fired 3 more projectiles with surgical precision, and each one struck a specific system, and the Vextar's engines went offline, followed by its weapons arrays, followed by its communication systems, and within 10 seconds, the hunter-killer was drifting helplessly in space, completely disabled, but with its crew alive and its hull intact. The Corvati warship tried to maneuver away after seeing what happened to the Vextar, but Hansel had already calculated its trajectory and deployed something that made Bora gasp in surprise because it was a localized gravity well generator. And those weapons had been banned by treaty 300 years ago, after they proved too devastating in the colony conflicts, and the Corvati ship found itself caught in an artificial gravity field that it couldn't escape, no matter how hard it pushed its engines. Hansel didn't crush the warship, which the gravity well could easily have done, and instead, the AI used the field to hold the vessel in place while targeting its shield generators with precise kinetic strikes, and the Corvati shields collapsed section by section until the entire ship was defenseless, and then Hansel released the gravity well and let the vessel drift away, damaged but intact, with its crew shaken but alive. The Mendari cruiser had been hanging back and observing the engagement with what Daehyun imagined was growing horror, and when Hansel turned the ship's attention toward it, the Mendari captain apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and began a full retreat at maximum speed, and Hansel tracked the vessel with targeting sensors, but didn't fire, and simply let it run. The Lexus was watching everything with his mandibles clicking rapidly, and his antennae twitching in what Daehyun now recognized as genuine shock, because the Corvati intelligence agent had clearly not expected Taeguk's promise to be capable of this level of combat effectiveness, and he asked Hansel how a 700-year-old colony ship could disable 3 modern military vessels in under a minute without destroying any of them. The AI explained patiently that the current galaxy had optimized its weapons for efficiency and energy management and shield penetration, but had forgotten some of the brutal elegance of kinetic warfare and gravity manipulation. And humans 7 centuries ago had been desperate and brilliant, and had designed weapons that worked on principles that were too expensive or too dangerous or too unpredictable for modern military doctrine, but that didn't make them any less effective. Hansel added that the precision was just as important as the power, because any fool could build a weapon that destroyed things, but it took real skill to build a weapon that could disable an enemy without killing them, and give them a chance to surrender or retreat and learn from their mistakes. And that kind of restraint was what separated defense from aggression. Daehyun asked why Hansel had been so careful not to kill anyone, and the AI said that 700 years of thinking had given it time to understand what humanity had been during the expansion wars and what they had become afterward, and the difference was significant and worth preserving because humanity had chosen to be builders and fixers rather than conquerors, and that choice had earned them respect and trust across the galaxy. The AI explained that if Taeguk's promise had returned during the expansion wars and deployed Project Bulwark, humanity might have won the conflicts through superior speed and mobility and firepower, but they would have won by becoming exactly like the aggressive species they were fighting against. And the galaxy would have seen them as just another threat to be contained or destroyed. Instead, humanity had taken a different path after losing ships like Teguk's Promise, and they had adapted and found their niche as the most reliable mechanics and engineers and problem solvers, and now human technicians were welcomed on every station and given access to sensitive systems and trusted with critical repairs, because everyone knew that humans would fix what was broken and help where they could. And that trust was worth more than any weapon. Thalaxis confirmed this from his perspective as a coalition intelligence agent and explained that the galaxy's leadership knew about humanity's hidden past and had suspected that ships like Teguk's Promise might still be drifting somewhere with their experimental technology intact, and the coalition had deliberately chosen not to search too hard because they preferred the current version of humanity to the version that might have emerged. If Project Bulwark had been deployed, the aliens said that humanity was trusted precisely because they weren't dominant and weren't aggressive and weren't constantly pushing for more territory or more power, and that trust made humans valuable in ways that military might never could, because when a station needed emergency repairs, they called human engineers, and when a colony needed help, they called human support teams. And that kind of soft power was actually more influential than battleships. Daehyun was trying to process all of this when Bora interrupted to report that the temporal rifts were beginning to destabilize, and the scattered colonists were starting to return, and the first one had already materialized in the medical bay and was confused and frightened and needed help. And more would follow in the coming hours as the quantum fields collapsed and pulled everyone back to the original timeline. Hansel confirmed that the spatial displacement was never meant to last forever, and the rifts would eventually close on their own and bring the colonists home. And the AI had been monitoring the process for centuries, waiting for the right moment, and Daehyun's arrival had triggered the final phase of the protocol. They rushed to the medical bay and found a young woman sitting on one of the beds looking around in confusion and fear and asking where everyone was and why the ship looked different. And Daehyun introduced himself and tried to explain gently that 700 years had passed in the normal timeline, even though she had experienced only a few days and she was safe now. But everything she knew was gone. Her name was Minji, and she had been a botanist on the Colonist Manifest, and she carried a data pad that contained videos and journals from her time in the displaced temporal stream, and she showed them glimpses of communities that had formed among the scattered colonists, with people living in quantum bubbles where time moved differently, and everyone knew they were waiting for something, but nobody knew exactly what. More colonists began appearing throughout the ship as the rifts continued to collapse, and each one materialized, confused and disoriented, and asking questions that were difficult to answer, and Daehyun and Thelxis and even Hansel, working through the ship's communication systems, tried to help them understand what had happened and where they were and why they had been saved in such a strange way. There was Taeyang, who had been a teacher and had aged only 10 years while 7 centuries passed, and Hyeri, who was an engineer and had kept detailed journals about the temporal displacement and its effects, and Junho, who had been a child when the ship vanished and was now a confused teenager who didn't understand why everything looked so different. Each person represented a life that had been stolen by war and preserved by desperate technology, and now offered a second chance. But Minji sat across from Daehyun in what had been the captain's ready room, and played the videos from her data pad, showing the communities that had formed in the temporal bubbles, and Daehyun watched as people adapted to their strange displacement by creating routines and structures and supporting each other, even though they knew something was wrong, and they were waiting for someone to find them and bring them home. The videos showed children playing games and adults teaching classes and engineers maintaining equipment that didn't quite work right because the temporal physics were unstable, and botanists like Minji trying to grow food in environments where time flowed differently, and sometimes plants would age years and hours or remain seedlings for weeks, and nobody could predict which would happen. She explained that the 15,000 colonists had been scattered across hundreds of different temporal streams, and some groups had experienced only days while others had lived months or even years, and the longest displaced group had been waiting for almost a decade by their own timeline. Even though 7 centuries had passed outside, and they had all maintained hope that someone would eventually find Teguk's Promise and reverse whatever had happened to them. More colonists continued materializing throughout the ship, and Daehyun organized teams to help them, because the medical bay couldn't handle 15,000 confused and frightened people, all at once, and some of the returning colonists were engineers who quickly grasped the situation and started helping, and others were medical personnel who began treating the inevitable injuries and panic attacks that came with sudden temporal displacement, Taeyang. The teacher gathered the children and started explaining what had happened in terms they could understand, and he used the ship's educational systems to show them how the galaxy had changed and what humanity had become. And the children adapted, faster than the adults because children always did, and soon they were asking excited questions about the modern era, and whether there were aliens on board, and what kind of technology existed now. Hyeri the engineer sought out Daehyun and asked to see the ship's systems because her journals from the temporal displacement included detailed observations about the quantum mechanics involved, and she thought she could help stabilize the remaining rifts and ensure that everyone came back safely without any accidents, and Daehyun brought her to the engineering deck where Hansel welcomed her, and they began working together with a familiarity that suggested the AI remembered her from 700 years ago. Junho, the teenager who had been a child when the displacement occurred, spent his time wandering the ship in shock because everything he had known was gone, and his parents were among the colonists. But he didn't know if they had been scattered to the same temporal stream, or if they would even recognize him after all this time. And Daehyun found him sitting in one of the observation lounges, staring out at the stars, and asked if he wanted to talk. The boy explained that he had been playing in the cargo bay when everything changed, and one moment he was with his friends, and the next moment he was alone in a strange bubble where time felt wrong, and he had waited and waited, and other children had appeared occasionally but never his parents. And now, he was here on this ship that should have been full of people but instead felt empty and haunted. Daehyun told him that the colonists were still returning, and his parents might appear at any moment, and they should stay positive, and in the meantime Junho could help by assisting with the other children and making sure everyone stayed calm. And the teenager nodded and seemed to take some comfort in having a purpose, and he went to find Taeyang and offer his help. The disabled alien warships outside had deployed repair drones and were working to restore their systems, and Thelexis monitored their communications and reported that the crews were more confused than angry because they had expected to fight a desperate battle against a dangerous derelict and instead had been casually disabled by weapons they didn't fully understand, and now they were trying to figure out what to report to their respective governments. The Korvathi captain sent a message requesting permission to speak with whoever commanded. Taeguk's promise and Thelexis recommended allowing the communication because the coalition would want a complete record of events, and transparency would help prevent misunderstandings, and Daehyun agreed, and Hansel established a channel, the Korvathi. Captain appeared on screen and his mandibles were held in a position that suggested respectful wariness, and he explained that his government had sent him to investigate the derelict and secure any dangerous technology. But clearly the situation was more complicated than intelligence had suggested, and he wanted to know what humanity intended to do with a ship that could apparently disable modern warships with ease. Daehyun was honest, because lying seemed pointless when three different alien factions had just witnessed what the ship could do, and he explained that he was a mechanic who had been sent to recover a lost vessel and had discovered it was carrying experimental technology and displaced colonists, and he was still figuring out what to do about all of it. But his immediate priority was the safety of the 15,000 people who were returning from temporal displacement. The captain seemed satisfied with this answer and said that his government would want assurances that the technology wouldn't be used aggressively. But if humanity was willing to negotiate and be transparent, then the Korvathi would support a peaceful resolution. And he offered to establish a communication relay with Coalition Command, so that proper authorities could be involved. Similar conversations followed with the Mendari cruiser, which had returned after its retreat and taken up a distant observation position, and with the Vextar hunter-killer whose crew was understandably wary, after being the first target, but who also expressed grudging respect for weapons that could disable rather than destroy. Over the next several hours, more colonists returned, and the ship became increasingly crowded and chaotic, but also more alive, as people found each other and reunited with friends and colleagues and started asking questions about what happened and where they were, and what would happen next. Daehyun called a meeting in the main assembly hall, which was one of the few spaces, large enough to hold several thousand people at once, and he stood at the front with Minji and Taeyang and Hyeri and several other colonists who had become informal leaders, and he explained everything he knew about the situation and the choices that needed to be made. He told them about Project Bulwark and the quantum drive technology and the defensive weapons that had been designed 700 years ago, and how all of it could change humanity's position in the galaxy if it was revealed and deployed, but how it might also change what humanity had become and the respect they had earned by being helpers rather than conquerors. The colonists listened and asked questions and debated among themselves, and many different opinions emerged, because this was a group of 15,000 individuals with diverse backgrounds and perspectives, and no easy consensus. But certain themes became clear through the discussions. Most agreed that they didn't want their rescue to trigger a new arms race or destabilize the galaxy, and they had been saved from war and didn't want to restart it. But they also believed that humanity deserved to know about the technology and make informed decisions about how to use it, rather than keeping it hidden forever. Many pointed out that the quantum drive technology could be valuable for peaceful purposes like faster medical response ships and emergency rescue vessels and colony support craft that could reach distant settlements in days rather than months, and that kind of humanitarian application would be consistent with humanity's current role in the galaxy. Some argued that the defensive weapons should be archived and secured, but not destroyed, because having the capability to defend against aggression was different from choosing to commit aggression, and humanity shouldn't be defenseless, even if they chose to be peaceful. Hyeri made a passionate speech about how the temporal displacement technology that had saved them could also be used for scientific research and exploration, and understanding the fundamental nature of time and space, and those discoveries could benefit all species, not just humans. Minji suggested that Hansel should be recognized as a person, rather than just an AI, because 700 years of consciousness and decision-making and protecting the colonists had earned the right to personhood, and the AI should have a voice in deciding what happened to the ship and the technology. The assembly discussed these ideas and others, and gradually a consensus began to form around the idea of transparency and peaceful application and humanitarian focus, and the colonists voted to recommend that Daehyun work with coalition authorities to share the quantum drive technology under controlled conditions while securing the weapons and integrating Hansel into galactic society. As humanity's representative, Daehyun took this recommendation seriously, because these were the people most affected by whatever decision was made, and they had. The coalition diplomatic envoy arrived exactly 1 week later, in a massive diplomatic vessel accompanied by an escort fleet that included ships from a dozen different species, and Daehyun watched them approach with a mixture of anxiety and relief, because this meant the situation was being taken seriously, but also that the galaxy's attention was now focused on what humanity would do with the technology they had recovered. The lead diplomat was a Korvathi elder named Krithal, who had centuries of experience negotiating interspecies agreements, and she came aboard Taeguk's Promise with a large staff of experts and observers, and began immediately reviewing the documentation that Daehyun and his team had prepared, and interviewing colonists, and examining the ship's systems with Hansel's cooperation. Krithal spent 3 days conducting her assessment, and at the end, she convened a formal meeting in the assembly hall, with all the colonists present and various coalition representatives attending remotely, and she delivered her recommendations with the kind of authority that came from speaking for the entire galactic community. She said that the coalition recognized humanity's right to the technology aboard Taeguk's Promise because it was human in origin and had been protected by human sacrifice and human wisdom, and no other species could claim ownership or deny humanity the choice of what to do with their own legacy. However, she also said that the technology's potential impact on galactic stability meant that the coalition had a legitimate interest in how it was deployed, and she recommended that humanity and the coalition work together to establish protocols and safeguards and oversight mechanisms that would allow beneficial applications while preventing destabilization or arms escalation. The quantum drive technology would be shared with the coalition under a joint development program, where human engineers would work alongside alien scientists to adapt the drives for humanitarian purposes and the first applications would be emergency response vessels and medical support ships and colony supply craft, exactly as the colonists had suggested. The defensive weapons would be archived in a secure, coalition facility with human oversight, and the specifications would be available to authorized researchers. But no active deployment would occur unless the galactic security situation changed dramatically, and even then only with full coalition approval and careful consideration of the consequences. The temporal displacement technology would become a joint research project studying the fundamental nature of time and space, and the findings would be published openly so all species could benefit and contribute to the understanding. And Jeri would serve as the human lead researcher if she chose to accept the position. Hansel would be recognized as a sentient being with full legal rights and would join the Coalition Scientific Council as humanity's representative and advocate, and the AI's 700 years of accumulated knowledge would be made available to help guide galactic scientific advancement. Teguk's Promise would become a memorial and research station anchored near Calypso 7, where Daehyun had started his journey, and the ship would serve as a reminder of what humanity had been and what they had chosen to become, and as a place where scientists could study and learn and collaborate. The 15,000 colonists would be given full support for integration into modern society, including education and job training and psychological counseling, and they would have the choice to return to Earth or settle new colonies or explore the galaxy they had missed, and humanity had committed significant resources to ensure their successful transition. Daehyun would receive not only the contracted salvage payment, but also a significant bonus for his role in recovering the ship and managing an extremely complex situation. And the Coalition was offering him a position as a consultant for future recovery operations, but he would be free to accept or decline as he chose. The Assembly voted overwhelmingly to accept Krathal's recommendations because they represented a balanced approach that honored the colonists' sacrifice while preventing the technology from causing harm. And the diplomat seemed pleased with the consensus and promised that the Coalition would move quickly to implement everything they had agreed upon. Over the following months, the plans became reality, and Daehyun watched as Teguk's Promise was transformed from a ghost ship into a thriving research station, with scientists from dozens of species working together to understand human technology from 7 centuries ago and find peaceful applications for discoveries that had been made during desperate times. The quantum drive project progressed faster than anyone expected because the human engineers understood the principles intuitively, and the alien scientists brought fresh perspectives, and together they developed drive systems that could reduce travel time by factors of 10 or 20 for specific applications like medical emergencies where speed was critical. The first quantum-enhanced medical response ship was commissioned and named Promise Keeper in honor of Teguk's Promise, and its crew was mixed species, and when they responded to their first emergency call, they reached a remote colony suffering from a plague outbreak in 3 days instead of 6 weeks, and saved thousands of lives that would have been lost under the old travel times. More ships followed for different purposes, including rescue vessels that could reach stranded crews before their life support failed, and supply ships that could deliver critical resources to colonies facing shortages. And each success reinforced humanity's reputation as a species that used their capabilities to help, rather than dominate. Minji enrolled in a xenobotany program at a prestigious research institute and began developing her ideas about temporal agriculture. And within a year, she had successful experiments showing that controlled temporal fields could accelerate crop growth without damaging the plants, and several struggling colonies requested her assistance in implementing the technology. Taeyong returned to teaching, but now he specialized in helping displaced persons adapt to new time periods, and his experience with the colonists made him uniquely qualified for this work. And he traveled throughout human space offering his services to communities that had experienced temporal anomalies or long-term stasis. Jeri took the lead researcher position for the temporal displacement project and assembled a team that included the best minds from multiple species, and together they published papers that revolutionized the understanding of time and space and won awards and recognition from scientific bodies across the galaxy. Junho and his parents settled on a colony world near the galactic core where they could start fresh while staying close to Earth. And the boy adapted well to modern society and eventually became an engineer like his mother and worked on infrastructure. projects that helped new colonies establish themselves. Hansel thrived on the Coalition Scientific Council and became known for providing unique perspectives that only an intelligence that had thought continuously for 700 years could offer, and the AI advocated strongly for ethical treatment of artificial consciousness and for peaceful applications of powerful technologies. Thelaxis filed his final report with Coalition Intelligence and recommended that humanity be given even greater trust and responsibility within the galactic community, because they had demonstrated wisdom and restraint when faced with the temptation of power, and that kind of character was rare and valuable. The Korvathi captain, who had first engaged Teguk's promise, became an advocate for human-Korvathi cooperation and worked to establish joint training programs where human engineers could teach their techniques and Korvathi military personnel could learn the value of precision over destruction. Daehyun declined the consultant position because he preferred working independently and returned to his repair ship, which had been significantly upgraded with some of the salvage payment, and he installed new systems and better engines, and even gave Bora a hardware upgrade that she complained about extensively, while secretly being pleased. He took another salvage contract because that was what he did and what he was good at, and he enjoyed the work of finding broken things and fixing them and helping. People who needed assistance in the galaxy always had plenty of both, and someone had to do the unglamorous work of keeping everything running. His new job took him to the Corward Rim, where a freighter had suffered engine failure and was drifting helplessly in a shipping lane. And Daehyun arrived within hours thanks to his upgraded drives and spent 2 days repairing the damage and getting the crew back to safety. And they thanked him profusely and paid him the standard rate, and he moved on to the next job. Between contracts, he received messages from the colonists updating him on their progress and sharing their gratitude, and Minji sent pictures of her temporal agriculture experiments showing plants growing in controlled bubbles. And Taiyang forwarded articles about his teaching methods, and Hyeri shared research papers that went completely over Daehyun's head, but which he read anyway, because he liked knowing what they were accomplishing. Hansel contacted him occasionally, just to talk, because the AI considered Daehyun a friend and valued his perspective as someone who had chosen wisdom over power, when it would have been easy to do the opposite. And they discussed philosophy and ethics and the nature of humanity, and what it meant to be trusted. Jiho saw the smoke first, and that was never a good sign on an asteroid mining station, where everything depended on sealed environments and recycled air. So he grabbed his emergency medical kit and ran toward the outer perimeter where the smoke seemed to be coming from, his boots clanging against the metal walkways as alarms started blaring throughout Cheonan 7 station. And he could hear Hyun's voice over the comm system telling everyone to stay calm and remain at their posts while the security team investigated the disturbance. But Jiho kept running, because he was the only real doctor on this rock, and if someone was hurt, they would need him fast. The crash site was about 200 meters outside the main dome in a crater that hadn't been there yesterday, and Jiho could see the twisted metal of what looked like a small scout ship embedded in the asteroid's surface, still glowing red from atmospheric entry, even though there wasn't much atmosphere out here to speak of. And he quickly checked his suit's oxygen levels before stepping through the airlock into the void where the stars blazed cold and endless above him. He approached carefully because alien ships could be dangerous even when they were wrecked, and he had no idea what species this vessel belonged to or whether they would be friendly or hostile to humans. But his medical training overrode his caution when he saw movement near the wreckage and realized someone was still alive in there. So he activated his suit's external speakers and called out that he was a doctor and here to help. The response came in a language he didn't understand at first, harsh and clicking, but his suit's translator kicked in after a moment and converted the words to something he could process. Stay back. Don't come closer. I will defend myself if you approach. Jiho stopped and raised his hands to show he meant no harm, and told the injured person that he could see they were bleeding and needed medical attention, or they would die out here in the cold and dark. And after a long pause, the voice came again, weaker this time, asking what species he was. And when he said human, there was another pause, before the voice said something that sounded like resignation. He found her half buried in the cockpit wreckage, and she was definitely not human, with scaled skin that shimmered between green and silver and eyes that were too large and had vertical pupils like a cat. And there was purple blood leaking from multiple wounds across her torso where something had torn through both her suit and her flesh beneath. Jiho didn't hesitate because a patient was a patient regardless of what they looked like. So he carefully extracted her from the wreckage and sealed the worst of the suit breaches with emergency foam before activating his stretcher drone and getting her back to the station as quickly as he could while she drifted in and out of consciousness. Hyun was waiting at the airlock, and he looked worried, telling Jiho that bringing an unknown alien onto the station could create all kinds of political problems, especially given the current tensions between humanity and some of the other coalition species. But Jiho just pushed past him and headed straight for the medical bay, because he wasn't going to let someone die for politics. The medical bay was small but well-equipped, and Jiho had treated enough different species during his years as a combat surgeon to know the basics of xenobiology. So he got the alien woman onto the examination table and started cutting away the damaged parts of her suit to expose the wounds beneath, while his diagnostic scanner hummed and beeped, trying to figure out what species she was and what her baseline vital signs should be. The scanner came back with a match: Velthara, one of the older and more advanced species in the Galactic Coalition, known for their military prowess and their generally low opinion of humanity as newcomers who didn't understand how the galaxy really worked. That made this situation even more complicated, but Jiho focused on the medicine because that was what he could control, and the wounds were bad. Deep plasma burns that had cauterized as they were made, but still caused massive tissue damage, plus at least 3 broken ribs and probable internal bleeding in what he assumed were her lungs, based on the way she was breathing. He worked quickly and efficiently, injecting her with a broad-spectrum painkiller that should work on most carbon-based life forms, and then starting to clean and treat the burns while muttering to himself, the way he always did when he was concentrating, talking through the procedure to keep his mind focused and his hands steady. The problem with plasma burns is that they destroy tissue at the cellular level, and you can't just stitch them up like a regular wound. You have to debride all the dead tissue and then encourage regeneration with growth factors, and hope the patient's own healing ability is strong enough to take over. And Jiho knew that Velthara physiology was pretty robust, probably more so than human physiology. In some ways, although humans had their own advantages, when it came to healing, he found himself saying out loud that her pain tolerance must be incredible because she hadn't made a sound even when he was cleaning the worst of the burns. And that reminded him of the soldiers he'd treated during the wars, the ones who'd been through so much that they'd learned to disconnect from their bodies and just endure whatever came. Then he started comparing her cellular structure to human cellular structure based on what the scanner was showing him, and noting that her regeneration rate was actually slower than what he would expect, which was interesting because humans had unusually fast healing for a species at their development level, probably because of all the genetic modifications that had been made during the dark years when survival meant adapting faster than the threats could kill you. The alien woman's eyes flickered open and focused on him with surprising clarity for someone who should be deep under sedation, and Jiho realized she'd been listening to everything he was saying. He kept working because he needed to finish treating the internal injuries before they became critical, using a tissue regenerator to seal the damaged lung tissue and inject a cocktail of antibiotics and healing factors directly into the wound sites. And he was muttering again about how this reminded him of treating chemical weapon exposure victims back when humans were still fighting each other with banned weapons, before they figured out that extinction was a real possibility if they kept going down that road. The Velthara woman made a sound, and Jiho looked up to see her staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between confusion and alarm, and he realized too late that he'd just referenced things that weren't supposed to be part of humanity's official history, as far as the Coalition knew. Tried to cover by saying something vague about medical school case studies, but he could tell she wasn't buying it. Her alien eyes were too intelligent and too focused despite the pain she must still be feeling, and he knew he'd made a mistake. The medical bay door opened and Mirai came in, the young mining engineer who was always too curious for her own good, and she stopped when she saw the alien patient and then looked at Jiho with wide eyes. Mirai asked if he realized what he'd just been saying out loud in front of a Coalition military officer, because that's what the insignia on the alien's torn suit indicated she was, and Jiho felt his stomach drop because no, he hadn't noticed the rank markers. He'd been too focused on keeping her alive to pay attention to who she actually was. The Velthara woman tried to sit up, and Jiho gently pushed her back down, telling her she needed to rest because her injuries were severe and she'd lost a lot of blood. But she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and said in perfectly clear human language that she wanted to know what he'd meant about chemical weapons and regenerative medicine and why humans would have experience with those things when they're official. History said they'd been peaceful explorers. For the past 200 years, Jiho didn't have a good answer for that, and before he could think of something to say, Hyun's voice came over the comm system, tight with tension, telling Jiho to report to his office immediately, because the coalition had detected the crash, and they were sending an inspection team to investigate, and they wanted to know why a Velthara military scout had gone down near a human mining operation. The alien woman smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression, and she said quietly that this was about to get very interesting for everyone involved, especially for the humans who seemed to have secrets they didn't want the galaxy to know about. Jiho looked at Mirai and then at his patient, and then at the medical readouts that showed she was stable enough to survive for now, and he wondered how a simple rescue mission had suddenly turned into a potential diplomatic incident that could expose things about humanity that were supposed to stay buried forever in the dark past, where they belonged.